Hello, students. Um, this is our first attempt at an online class. I am recording now from a quiet room in a library, not my office, because I didn't want to park and walk. It takes a while. I don't have many fancy resources, as some other professors likely do. So this whole recording of the classes might be a little bit low-key. I have slides that are very pretty bare. And most importantly, I have a friend who's going to be helping me with these classes. Kukuluku. Say hello, Kukuluku.
Hello, my name's Kukuluku.
Okay. Kukuluku will join us as we explore our topics. And the next topic is animal ethics. And I'm going to first look at some arguments from Peter Singer and from Tom Reagan. Kind of different arguments for the conclusion that the way we use animals, our farming animals, our experimenting on animals is wrong, seriously wrong. And then I'll look at the opposite view. I'll focus on Peter Carruthers' argument for the conclusion that we are permitted to use animals in the way we do, to farm them and to experiment on them and to wear their skins and so on. I hope that the classes get better as we go along. I'm new to this recording software and to recording classes, and this feels very awkward to me. I'm not sure how to do it. One thing I've decided is that I should record in short chunks. So maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes sessions, because if I make a really terrible kind of stupid mistake that I don't want to embarrass me for posterity, I can just restart a section without having to restart a whole lecture that's an hour or more long. Well, let's see how it goes. And let me try share for the first time. I'm going to click the share button. I don't know if you can see it on my screen, but there's a little share button that should share my slides on animal ethics. Oh, there we go. I hope you can see it. And maybe you can see me too. I don't know if you can see my pointer as I move it across the slide. No idea. Oh, there's some little buttons at the bottom of my screen. That gives me a laser pointer. Oh, well, if you couldn't see my pointer before, maybe you can see my laser pointer now. It doesn't let me draw. What if I want to draw? Oh, there, a pen. Yay. All right. Okay. I hope you can see that even if you can't see my pointer, my cursor, my regular cursor. So we're starting off looking at Peter Singer's arguments about animal ethics. Peter Singer wrote a big book called Animal Liberation that ignited a lot of debate. It's a big book, but a readable book. And he argued that the ways we use animals, our farming animals, our experimenting on animals, is seriously morally wrong. And wrong in quite the same way that racism and sexism are wrong. He calls our prejudice against animals speciesism. And just as we've discovered that racism and sexism are wrong, he thinks we should discover that speciesism is wrong. You might think there's a big difference between humans and other animals, and a big difference that makes racism and sexism wrong, even while speciesism isn't wrong. And on my slides, I've put down just two proposals about what makes a big difference between humans and animals, such that discriminating against other humans, regardless of their race or sex or so on, is wrong, but discriminating against other animals is okay. And the first proposal is just that there's a biological difference between humans and other animals. Humans are members of the species Homo sapiens. Animals, like Kukuluku, are members of the species Koala sapiens, or something like that. Singer doesn't think that this marks a morally significant difference. After all, if biology makes a moral difference, biology alone makes a moral difference between humans and other species, koalas, then it stands to reason that biology could mark a difference within the human species, between different races, between different sexes. Just as the speciesist says, hey, that's silly to think that our discrimination against animals is wrong. After all, aren't they of a different species? There is a biological difference. The racist or the sexist could similarly say, hey, it's silly to think that racism or sexism are wrong. After all, there are biological differences between the races and sexes. And that kind of answer strikes us as strange. That answer from the racist or the sexist. Why should mere biological difference make for a difference, a moral difference in the way we should treat people? But then why should a mere biological difference make for a difference in the way we treat other species? Here's another little objection I've put on the slide. There are cases where I think it would be pretty clear that discrimination and prejudice against another species is wrong, despite the fact that there's a biological difference. So consider ET. ET is a different species, right? An extraterrestrial species. But I think we all feel sympathy for ET. We wouldn't consider torturing, killing, eating ET, experimenting on ET, and so on. We think that doing this to ET is wrong. I don't remember what happens in the movie ET, but maybe some people try to experiment on or harm ET, and we feel a lot of sympathy for ET. Or imagine that we discover, quite amazingly, that some group of people that we took to be members of the species Homo sapiens are actually a member of another species. I don't know how this is biologically possible for them to look so similar to us, but it turns out that way. They look like us, they live with us, they work with us, and yet it turns out that they're a member of another species. Maybe we just don't reproduce with them, and we've always thought that this was an issue of infertility. But in fact, it's a species difference that makes for the difference. Let's say we learned this. This is far-fetched, but let's say we learned this. Would you think it's okay to now start farming those other people? Would you think it's now okay to start killing them and eating their flesh and wearing their skins as leather? Experimenting on them? Surely not. So we see that a biological difference isn't sufficient for a moral difference in these cases. And so the idea that there's a biological difference between humans and animals, and that difference is sufficient for our treating animals in such radically different ways, doesn't seem to be promising. But you might think that this biological difference grounds something else. It's the basis of some other difference that is morally relevant. Okay. Our biology gives us bigger brains. Okay. We are smarter than most animals.
You're not smarter than me.
Okay. And that the difference in intelligence marks a moral difference between human beings and animals. So that it's morally permissible to farm and eat and experiment on animals, but not on humans, because animals are dumb and humans are smart. Well, there's a proposal. And it certainly is the case that humans are typically smarter than animals. But does smartness mark a moral difference? Is it morally relevant here? And there are a couple of objections I've put on the slide against this proposal too. Okay. The first objection, maybe they're related objections. Maybe they're the same, and I should have prepared these slides more carefully. But you know, I'm lazy. Is that it doesn't seem in other cases to be permissible to discriminate against people because of their difference in intelligence. Okay. Some people are smarter than other people. You might have noticed. It aggravates me when I discover people who are smarter than me. Does it aggravate me? Nah, most people are. Maybe that's why I'm in a bad mood. Well, I'm not really in such a bad mood. Okay, anyhow, it would seem to be wrong for smart people to farm and experiment on and so on less intelligent people. It would seem not to be permissible for the Einsteins and Isaac Newtons to oppress the rest of us, putting us in cages, fattening us up so they could eat our flesh. And the second objection here points out that there are marginal cases when it comes to human beings too. There are human beings that are not as smart as Kukuloko.
Hello. There are many people who aren't as smart as Kukuloko.
Babies, newborns, can do a lot less than koalas. Their thoughts are simpler than koalas, I presume. And cows and pigs and so on are capable of quite sophisticated cognition and experiences that newborn babies aren't. If you think that it's permissible to kill and eat a cow because it's less intelligent than you, is it permissible then to kill and eat a newborn that's even less intelligent than a cow? Surely not. That's crazy. And just as we realize that intelligence differences don't make a moral difference in this case, in marginal cases, when it comes to people who are less intelligent, newborns, mentally disabled people, so too we should conclude, if we're to be consistent, that intelligence doesn't mark a morally relevant difference when it comes to animals and our treatment of animals. And the same kind of reasoning can be used, the same kind of thought about marginal cases can be used to eliminate other proposed morally relevant differences between people and animals. So you might think that what makes for the difference between people and animals is their linguistic abilities or their creativity, their differences in linguistic abilities. Humans can talk a lot more than animals, or their differences in creativity, or their differences in moral agency. But we can find in each case human beings who are not so linguistically capable or creative, or that don't have so much moral agency. Think again of very young human beings. And we don't think that that means that that is permissible to treat them as badly as we treat animals. So these proposed differences don't seem to mark a morally relevant difference. All right, that slide is done. let's move on to the next. What does, Singer asks, what does make racism and sexism wrong? Once we discover the crucial ingredient in the wrongness of racism and sexism, once we identify this, we can see how it applies in the case of animals. And Singer does think it applies in the case of animals, and that just as racism and sexism are wrong because of this ingredient, so too speciesism is wrong because of this ingredient. And the reason Singer thinks that racism and sexism are wrong isn't because other races are biologically human and other sexes are biologically human. The reason that racism and sexism are wrong isn't because other races and other sexes are equally intelligent. They are, but even if they weren't, if we discovered this isn't the case, if we discovered that some race or some sex were less good at, I don't know, math or writing books or something, that wouldn't justify, even if that were the case, that wouldn't justify treating people of that race or of that sex differently. It would still be wrong. So what makes racism and sexism wrong are not biology or intelligence differences, which don't exist. Even if they did, they wouldn't make racism and sexism. They wouldn't be the crucial ingredient making racism and sexism wrong. I think I got a little tongue-tied there. I might not have said something quite properly, but I'm not going to go back and re-say it. Maybe I put in a knot or something. I was a little out of it. I wasn't thinking exactly. Whatever. What makes racism and sexism wrong is, according to Singer, that we should give equal weight to the like interest of those affected by our actions. We should treat, when we interact with other people, we should give their interests equal consideration. And he calls this the principle of the equal consideration of interests. And it's on the slide. Whoopsie. How do I get my little pen again? Pen. Can I make the pen a little thicker? Maybe a different color too? I don't know. So racism is wrong because you're treating the interests of some people, their interests in being happy, in not suffering pain, in having certain opportunities, and so on and so forth, differently than you're treating the interests of other people, the like interests. Okay. No matter one's race, one has an interest in being happy and not suffering. No matter one's sex, one has an interest in being happy and not suffering. Okay. And we should respect those interests and preferences of people. Racism and sexism don't. They respect the interests of one group of people, but not the others. And in this principle of equal consideration of interests, we make no mention of species or intelligence, of biology or smarts. We saw that those aren't morally relevant considerations. But now, just as we have interests in being happy, in not suffering, animals, insofar as they can be happy and not suffer, have an interest in those things too. Okay. And we do know that animals have the relevant psychological states. How do we know this? Well, there's evidence, behavioral evidence, that animals can feel pain and pleasure if you put a hot iron on a cat, it will scream and meow, just as you would. It would writhe in pain and try to escape, just as you would. It shows the same kind of behavior that you would if I were to put a hot iron against you. Sorry about the example. Also, animals have relevantly similar physiology to us. They've got brains, and their brains have certain shapes and chemicals, nociception and so on goes on in their brains. So insofar as animals behave in the same way as we do, and they have some similar physiology as we do, when you put a hot iron to them, okay, it stands to reason that they feel the same kind of pain we do when you put a hot iron to us. Again, apologies about the example. And similarly, animals can feel pleasure just as we do. So that they evince the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of biology that are evidence for the relevant psychological states, for their being able to experience pleasure and pain, which are things we have interests about, and that they have interests about too. Some philosophers historically have denied that animals have, by the way, psychological states. Descartes thought that animals were like automatons, something like robots, or very well constructed machines, even though they scream and try to escape when you damage their flesh. They don't really feel anything inside. There are no lights on inside. That seems crazy.
I strongly disapprove of that idea.
Okay, so there are the ingredients for our first argument. Two premises and a conclusion, not very complicated. I hope it captures Peter Singer's thought closely enough. The first premise is the principle of equal consideration of interests. We should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. And the second premise is that farming and experimenting on animals doesn't give equal weight to the interests of those animals. And the conclusion is that we should not farm or experiment on animals. Farming and experimenting on animals typically involves a lot of cruelty towards those animals. It causes those animals immense suffering. A large part of Peter Singer's book is to illustrate just how cruel factory farming and animal experimentation are. The animals are kept in very small confines, unnatural confines. Animals are often beaten and abused by their handlers. For example, pigs are, their tails are docked and they are castrated without any anesthetic. This doubtless causes them immense pain. Chickens have their tips of their beaks chopped off, and they're kept in these really tight cages. You can, on this point, I think if you want to see this, if you have the stomach for it, go to YouTube and look up these videos by animal rights groups that expose what's going on in factory farms, like PETA and so on. You'll see some horrific treatment of animals that is very typical of the way animals are treated on factory farms. Now, of course, there are happy farms where animals have it a lot better, but since farming is typically factory farming, Singer's argument applies to most farming of animals. Even if you think that it doesn't apply to, the family farming of animals, where animals are treated a lot better in natural environments and so on, the argument has some bite, a lot of bite. We should radically reform, if Peter Singer is right, the way we treat animals. Okay, so I hope the last few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or more, have made clear Peter Singer's argument. This again is really awkward for me. I'm sorry if this isn't as lively or as fun and entertaining as my classes, my lectures in class. I'm talking to a computer screen. I hope I'll get more used to it and it will get better as we go along. I'm going to pause now and try to save this video just to see that this works. And then in the next video, I'll consider objections and replies, objections against this argument, as well as replies to the objections. Okay, and so on. Thank you for your time now. I hope this is okay and makes some sense. Goodbye for now from Kukuluku 2.
Farewell. Have a lovely day.
And I'll be recording another video shortly.